There is a number that sits at the center of the 20th century, like a wound that never fully closed. 6 million. Say it slowly. 6 million human beings. Men, women, children, grandmothers in Warsaw apartments, schoolboys in Krakow, infants in Vilna, systematically identified, isolated, dehumanized, and murdered by a modern European state and its collaborators, not in some ancient era of ignorance, but between 1933 and 1945, while the world largely watched. This documentary is not comfortable. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be true. You are about to spend several hours with one of the most exhaustively studied events in recorded human history, and yet, paradoxically, one of the most frequently misunderstood. There are people who reduce it to Hitler. There are people who reduce it to gas chambers. There are people who have never encountered the name Wannsee or the word Einsatzgruppen, or understood why the Nuremberg laws of 1935 were not the beginning but merely one chapter in a much longer bureaucratic architecture of destruction. So here is what this documentary will do. It will start at the beginning, not the first shot, not the first camp, but the first idea. Because mass murder of this scale does not arrive like a thunderstorm. It builds the way a bureaucracy builds, form by form, law by law, policy by policy, until ordinary people find themselves embedded in machinery they no longer feel responsible for. We will move through 15 chapters. We will not skip the difficult parts. We will not soften the record for the sake of comfort. But we will also not turn suffering into spectacle. The people in this story are not statistics. They are not abstractions. They were people who had favorite foods and argued about money and worried about their children's futures. Right up until the moment a regime that had been building toward murder for over a decade reached their door. You stay with this documentary through to its final chapter. You will understand not only what happened, but how it happened. And that distinction between what and how is the most urgent historical question of our time, because the how is disturbingly ordinary. The how involves paperwork and train schedules and bureaucratic euphemism. The how involves neighbors. Stay with us. This is a story that belongs to everyone, because what human beings did to other human beings in the middle of the last century is not a German story. It is not a Jewish story. It is a human story, and the only appropriate response to a human story is human attention. If this documentary moves you, share it, talk about it. The moment we stop teaching this history is the moment we begin, however slowly, to repeat it. Chapter 1. The Long Roots, Anti-Semitism. Before Hitler, let me begin not in 1933, not with a chancellor being sworn into office, not with the first concentration camp being opened at Dachau. Let me begin with a quieter, older kind of hostility, one that had been accumulating for centuries before Adolf Hitler was even born. There is a temptation when we study the Holocaust to treat it as a singular eruption, as if hatred of that magnitude could only exist in one man's psychology. Historians have spent decades pushing back against that reading. The German scholar Saul Friedländer, in his monumental 2-volume study, described what he called redemptive anti-Semitism, the idea that hatred of Jews in Nazi Germany was not merely prejudice, but a quasi-religious belief that Germany could only be saved by removing Jewish influence from its body politic. That is not a belief that was invented in the 1920s. It had intellectual predecessors stretching back to the Middle Ages. Jews had lived in Europe for more than 2,000 years. Yet, throughout the medieval period, they were subjected to persecution rooted in Christian theological tradition. The accusation that Jews bore collective responsibility for the death of Jesus. This theological hostility generated legal discrimination across much of Europe. Jews were barred from owning land, excluded from guilds, confined to ghettos, expelled from England in 1290, from France periodically across several centuries, from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. These were not minor inconveniences. They were state-organized removals that shaped where Jewish communities could survive, how they could earn a living, and how they understood their own precarious place in European society. By the 19th century, something new was being added to this ancient theological hostility: the language of race. In 1879, a German journalist named Wilhelm Marr became among the first to articulate what he called racial anti-Semitism. The idea that Jews were not merely practitioners of a different religion who might be assimilated, but a biologically distinct and dangerous race whose influence could only be eliminated, not reformed. This was a conceptual shift of enormous consequence. Religious anti-Semitism could theoretically be resolved through conversion. Racial anti-Semitism had no such exit. It was permanent, it was hereditary, and it would eventually provide the ideological vocabulary for genocide. In 1899, the British-German writer Houston Stewart Chamberlain published The Foundations of the 19th Century, a work of elaborate racial theory that argued European social problems were rooted in Jewish domination. This book was not a pamphlet circulated in fringe circles. It sold widely, was admired by Kaiser Wilhelm II, and was later cited as an influence by Nazi ideologues. Its importance is not that it was intellectually serious, because it was not. Its importance is that it gave racial anti-Semitism a veneer of scholarly respectability at precisely the moment when European nationalism was reaching fever pitch. The Dreyfus Affair in France, beginning in 1894, when a Jewish military officer was falsely accused of treason, and the French establishment largely refused to correct the error, demonstrated something essential: that even in a republic, even in the country of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, Jews could be singled out, falsely accused, and stripped of their dignity by an institution that cared more about its own credibility than the truth. The Hungarian journalist Theodor Herzl watched the Dreyfus trial from Paris and concluded that Jewish emancipation in Europe was a promise that Europe could not keep. He went home and began writing The Jewish State. The founding intellectual document of Zionism was born from the failure of European liberalism to protect one man. Then came the First World War, and with it, catastrophe that reshaped everything. Germany entered the war with a modern, confident sense of itself as a great power. It exited the war in November 1918 without a single enemy soldier on German soil, its army undefeated in the field. And yet somehow the country was signing an armistice. This was a psychological rupture from which the Weimar Republic never fully recovered. The stab-in-the-back myth, the claim, promoted by former Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg among others, that Germany had been betrayed from within by socialists and Jews, was not a marginal conspiracy theory. It was promoted by decorated military commanders and repeated as fact in respectable newspapers. It was politically useful, and it planted the seed for a political movement that would make that myth into government policy. In 1919, a document that had already been circulating in Russia reached a wider European audience. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated account of a Jewish conspiracy for world domination, was exposed as a forgery almost immediately after publication. The exposure made no difference. The text was distributed across Europe and North America, translated into dozens of languages, and cited in anti-Jewish publications for decades. Henry Ford, the American industrialist, printed excerpts in his newspaper, The Dearborn Independent, and distributed 500,000 copies. Adolf Hitler later acknowledged reading it. A lie of sufficient ambition, it turns out, does not need to be true to be dangerous. It only needs an audience that wants to believe it. This is the soil from which Nazism grew. Not sterile ground, not sudden inspiration, but centuries of accumulated prejudice, freshly fertilized by military defeat, economic humiliation, and the intellectual respectability of racial pseudoscience. When a small, angry political party in Munich began meeting in beer halls in 1919, they were not inventing a new hatred. They were borrowing a very old one and repackaging it with the urgency of a nation that had convinced itself it was fighting for its survival. Understanding this is not optional. It is the only way to understand everything that comes after. Before we go any further, a word about methodology. The history you're watching was assembled from scholarship spanning 8 decades, from the immediate post-war trials at Nuremberg to the most recent work published by Cambridge University IC Press in 2025, which documents how our understanding of the Holocaust's continental scale and the breadth of local participation continues to expand. Historians still debate when exactly Hitler made the final decision to systematically murder all of Europe's Jews. They debate the relative weight of ideology versus circumstance. These debates are real, and they matter. You deserve to know they exist. This is not a simple story with simple answers. It is a story about human beings, and human beings are never simple. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Nazi Party, from Beer Hall to Ballot Box. On the 5th of January 1919, a small political organization called the German Workers' Party was founded in Munich by Anton Drexler and Karl Harrer. At its earliest meetings, the party had fewer members than a village council. It had no significant funds, no military backing, no credibility in the established political order of Weimar Germany. It was, by any conventional measure, irrelevant. Within 14 years, its ideology would control a nation of 67 million people. Understanding how that transition happened is one of the central questions in all of modern history. Adolf Hitler joined the German Workers' Party in September 1919 as its 55th member, assigned not to lead it, but to observe and report on it for the army. He stayed because he recognized that its blend of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism articulated something he had been carrying privately since his years of poverty and resentment in Vienna. On the 24th of February 1920, he addressed approximately 2,000 people in Munich and proclaimed the party's 25-point program, a document that called for a pan-German state, the exclusion of Jews from citizenship, and the abrogation of the Treaty of Versailles. The crowd responded with enthusiasm. Hitler discovered he had a talent that very few politicians possess. He could speak directly to fear. The Weimar Republic, established after the war, was a democracy that never truly enjoyed democratic legitimacy in the eyes of a substantial portion of its own population. It had been born in defeat, signed an armistice, and accepted a peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, that stripped Germany of roughly 13% of its territory, all of its overseas colonies, and required it to accept sole responsibility for the war under Article 231. Reparations were set at figures that most ordinary Germans found incomprehensible. The Republic also faced communist uprisings on the left and nationalist paramilitary violence on the right. It governed through perpetual crisis, and in the early 1920s, a hyperlater inflation so severe that the cost of a loaf of bread could change between the time you entered a bakery and the time you reached the counter, gutted whatever remained of middle-class savings. The Nazi Party's first major attempt at power was the Beer Hall Putsch of the 8th of November, 1923. Inspired by Mussolini's successful march on Rome the previous year, Hitler tried to seize the Bavarian government in Munich as a staging point for a march on Berlin. The attempt collapsed within hours. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, of which he served less than 9 months. The failed coup was, in a peculiar way, the making of Hitler's career. He had been a regional agitator. The trial gave him a national stage. He used it as a platform for his ideology, rather than a defense against the charges. And in his comfortable prison cell, he began dictating Mein Kampf, a text that spelled out, with considerable explicitness, exactly what he intended to do to Germany and to the Jews of Europe. The 1920s and the first years of the 1930s brought the Great Depression to Germany. By the early years of the decade, roughly 6 million Germans were unemployed. The Nazi Party, which had been declining in relevance during the relative stability of the mid-1920s, suddenly found enormous audiences for its message of national renewal, its promise of order, its identification of enemies to blame. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest single party in the Reichstag, capturing approximately 230 of 608 seats. They did not have a majority, but in a parliamentary system fractured among dozens of competing parties, being the largest was leverage enough. Here is where German politics, in early 1933, becomes a study in how democracies can be surrendered. The established conservative politicians who helped bring Hitler to power, men like former Chancellor Franz von Papen and President Paul von Hindenburg, did not believe Hitler could be controlled. They believed they could control him. They thought his energy and popular appeal could be harnessed for their own agenda, that his movement's more extreme elements would be tamed by the responsibilities of office, that he was, at bottom, a manageable political phenomenon. On the 30th of January, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. It was a backroom political arrangement that would prove to be among the most consequential miscalculations in political history. Within weeks of taking power, the Nazis began dismantling the institutional infrastructure of democracy with remarkable speed. On the 27th of February, 1933, the Reichstag building burned, whether by Nazis' arson or the act of a lone Dutch communist, as the official investigation claimed. The fire became the pretext for the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended the German constitution and most civil liberties the following morning. Then came the enabling act of the 23rd of March, 1933, which effectively transferred legislative authority to the Hitler cabinet, allowing him to govern by decree. The enabling act passed with support from Catholic centrists and conservatives who calculated, again fatally incorrectly, that cooperation might preserve some modicum of institutional independence. All other political parties were banned by July of that year. On the 22nd of March, 1933, 3 weeks after Hitler became Chancellor, the first concentration camp opened at Dachau, located roughly 10 miles northwest of Munich, at an abandoned munitions factory. It was not initially built for Jews. Its first inmates were communists, trade unionists, and political opponents of the Nazi regime, people classified as enemies of the new order. The system that began at Dachau would, over the following 12 years, metastasize into a network of more than 1,000 camps, subcamps, and detention facilities spread across German-controlled Europe. But in the spring of 1933, most Germans paid it little attention. Most believed the rumors of abuse were exaggerated. Most had other things to worry about. And therein lies one of the most important and uncomfortable lessons of this entire story. Persecution on this scale requires not only active perpetrators, but a much larger population of people who choose, for a variety of reasons, not to look too closely. Chapter 3. The Laws Before, the Camps, Persecution. By bureaucracy. There is a version of Holocaust history that focuses almost exclusively on the camps, the gas chambers, the mass graves, the liberation footage. This version, while not inaccurate, begins the story too late. It misses something essential about the mechanism of genocide, that it was constructed, piece by careful piece, through legislation, through civil service regulations, and medical licensing codes, and school enrollment quotas, and passport requirements. Before anyone was deported, before any camp was built for Jews specifically, the German state spent 6 years systematically stripping Jewish citizens of the normal infrastructure of modern life. In the spring of 1933, the persecution of German Jews began with what might have sounded, to the outside observer, like administrative tidying. On the 7th of April, 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service barred most Jews and communists from government employment. A week later, a similar law restricted Jews from practicing law, then medicine, then tax consulting, then journalism under the Editor Law of October 1933. The effect, considered law by law, might be described as occupational exclusion, but the cumulative effect across hundreds of professions and community structures was the systematic removal of Jews from German economic and civic life, a legal architecture designed to make remaining in Germany economically untenable. On the 10th of May, 1933, in a spectacle that reverberated around the world, ceremonial book burnings swept through German university towns. In Berlin, a bonfire on the Unter den Linden consumed works deemed un-German, which included, comprehensively, the work of Jewish writers and intellectuals. Heinrich Heine, the 19th century German poet, himself Jewish, had written a line that was quoted extensively afterward. Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people also. He had written it more than 100 years earlier, about a different time and a different place. His books were among those burned on that May evening. The Nuremberg laws, passed on the 15th of September, 1935, represented a formalization and expansion of this legal framework. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of German citizenship entirely, reducing them from citizens to what the regime called state subjects, people who lived in Germany but no longer belonged to it. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor criminalized marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. Jews were defined legally as those with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. Those with 1 or 2 were classified as Mischling, a word roughly translating to mixed breeds, with varying and shifting sets of rights. This taxonomic precision is worth pausing on. The Nazi state did not merely want to exclude Jews. It wanted to categorize them with bureaucratic exactitude, to draw clean lines through human families, to turn ancestry into legal status. The process required an enormous amount of paperwork and a great many civil servants to complete it. By 1937 and into 1938, the economic squeeze intensified. Aryanization, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned businesses to non-Jewish Germans, usually at drastically below market prices, began to accelerate. Jews were required to register assets above 5,000 Reichsmarks. Jewish doctors were prohibited from treating non-Jewish patients. Jewish children were gradually excluded from the German public school system. Jewish men who had fought for Germany in the First World War, men who had been awarded the Iron Cross, who had lost brothers and friends in the trenches of Flanders and Verdun, found themselves classified as racially alien enemies of the state they had bled for. The context inside Germany matters, but the international context also matters enormously, because this is where one of the most morally uncomfortable chapters of this history begins: the response of the rest of the world. In July 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt convened a conference at Evian-les-Bains in France, bringing together representatives of 32 nations to address the crisis of Jewish refugees fleeing Germany. Of the 32 nations present, virtually none agreed to significantly increase their immigration quotas. The Dominican Republic and Costa Rica offered to accept some refugees. The United Kingdom declined to allow more Jewish immigration to British-controlled Palestine. The United States declined to exceed its existing restrictive quota system. The message that the Evian Conference sent to the Nazi regime, intentionally or not, was that the world was not prepared to accept Jewish refugees. This matters for what comes later. It matters enormously. In May 1939, the ocean liner Sant Louis sailed from Hamburg carrying 937 passengers. the vast majority of them Jewish refugees. They were denied entry to Cuba. They were turned away by the United States. They were refused by Canada. The ship was forced to return to Europe, where its passengers disembarked in Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Of those who landed in continental Europe, more than 250 were subsequently murdered in the Holocaust. These were not people who had failed to try to leave. They had purchased tickets. They had crossed an ocean. The world sent them back. Then came the 9th and 10th of November, 1938. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, organized by the Nazi leadership following the shooting of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jewish man named Herschel Greenspan, whose parents had just been deported from Germany to Poland. The pogrom was presented as a spontaneous popular uprising. It was not spontaneous. More than 7,500 Jewish shops were looted and vandalized. More than 1,000 synagogues were damaged or destroyed. At least 90 Jews were murdered that night. As many as 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. German Jews were then collectively fined more than 1 billion Reichsmarks to pay for the damage that had been done to their own property. The international press reported on Kristallnacht extensively. There was widespread condemnation, and then, largely, the world moved on. Germany watched to see if there were consequences. There were none of any significance. By the end of 1938, the persecution of German Jews had been underway for 5 years. Roughly half of the approximately 560,000 Jews in Germany in January 1933 had emigrated. Those who remained were disproportionately elderly, poor or female, people with fewer resources and options. What was coming would arrive not with further warning, but with the sound of tank engines crossing into Poland. Chapter 4. The invasion of Poland and the machinery of ghettos. At approximately 0445 hours on the 1st of September 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. The Wehrmacht had been mobilizing for weeks. The justification offered to the German public and international community that Polish forces had attacked a German radio station at Gliwice was a fabrication staged by the SS, actors dressed in Polish uniforms, a manufactured provocation for a war that had already been decided. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. For the Jews of Europe, the strategic calculations of nation-states had just dramatically narrowed their world. Poland in 1939 held the largest Jewish population in Europe. Approximately 3.3 million people, roughly 10% of the country's total population. They lived in cities and small towns, in dense urban neighborhoods and rural villages, in an extraordinarily diverse range of economic and cultural circumstances. Warsaw's Jewish community of roughly 350,000 was one of the largest Jewish urban populations in the world. The Jewish communities of Łódź, Kraków, Lwów, and Vilna had centuries of cultural and intellectual heritage. They were not a monolithic population. They were Poles who were Jewish, with all the complexity that entails. The German invasion was accompanied from the beginning by targeted killings. Special units called Einsatzgruppen, mobile security task forces, followed the army into Poland with orders to eliminate Polish leadership. Intellectuals, clergy, politicians, military officers, and Jewish community leaders. Around 50,000 Polish and Polish Jewish leaders and intellectuals were arrested or executed in the first weeks. These were not battlefield casualties. They were targeted executions of civil society. The stated objective was to prevent organized Polish resistance by decapitating Polish cultural and intellectual life at its root. A similar approach had been used to lesser effect in occupied Czechoslovakia. In Poland, it was applied with greater scale and less restraint. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east on the 17th of September, pursuant to a secret protocol in the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact that had carved Poland into spheres of influence. This division of Poland is one of the less frequently discussed aspects of the early Holocaust years. Roughly 260,000 Polish Jews ended up in Soviet-controlled territory, where conditions were harsh and oppressive, but where most of them survived the war, because the systematic killing apparatus had not yet reached them. The geography of survival in the Holocaust was often a matter of which direction the army marched first. Beginning in late 1939 and accelerating through 1940, German occupation authorities established ghettos to segregate the Jewish population of Poland. The first sealed ghetto was completed at Piotrków Trybunalski in October 1939. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in October 1940 and sealed by November, confining approximately 400,000 people. The figure fluctuated as more Jews were forced in from surrounding areas to a walled area of roughly 3.5 square kilometers. The Łódź Ghetto, the first to be sealed, confined 200,000 people. To provide some scale for what these numbers mean in physical space, the Warsaw Ghetto's population density was among the highest ever recorded in an urban area, exceeding the most overcrowded tenements of early 20th century New York by an enormous margin. Conditions inside the ghettos were designed to be lethal, even before any formal extermination policy was implemented. Food rations allocated to ghetto inhabitants were calibrated to produce malnutrition. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the official daily calorie allocation for Jews was a fraction of that provided to non-Jewish Poles, and a fraction again of that provided to Germans. People starved on the streets. Children begged at ghetto walls. By mid-1941, roughly 30,000 people had died in the ghettos from starvation and disease alone, before any systematic killing program had been launched. The Nazi regime had discovered something about mass death. You did not always need to deploy men with guns. You could create conditions and let the conditions do their work. Within the ghettos, Jewish community councils, the Judenrat, were given authority by the German occupation and held responsible for carrying out German demands, including the maintenance of order, the administration of food distribution, and eventually the compilation of lists for deportation. The historiography of the Judenrat is one of the most contested areas in Holocaust scholarship. Historians have debated for decades whether the councils were instruments of collaboration, mechanisms of impossible negotiation, or something altogether more complex and tragic. The Israeli historian Raoul Hilberg, who wrote the foundational 3-volume study of the Holocaust's administrative machinery, The Destruction of the European Jews, argued that cooperation with the German demands only prolonged the process, without ultimately preventing the outcome. Others, including Hannah Arendt, in her controversial report on the Eichmann trial, drew sharp judgments about individual leaders. The debate continues, and it does not have a clean resolution, because the situation in which these people found themselves had no clean resolution. In 1940, Germany invaded Western Europe. The Netherlands fell in May. Belgium surrendered in late May. France signed an armistice in June, and the collaborationist Vichy government under Marshal Philippe Pétain took authority over the unoccupied South. With each new conquest, hundreds of thousands more Jews came under German control, or the control of collaborationist governments. The Netherlands had approximately 140,000 Jews. Belgium had approximately 80,000. France had around 350,000, of whom roughly 80,000 were ultimately deported and killed. The machinery of persecution that had been developed in Germany and then expanded into Poland was now scaling across a continent. The summer of 1941 was still months away. The mass killing had not yet begun, but everything that followed was, in a sense, already implicit in what had already been built. The laws, the registers, the ghettos, the camps, the bureaucratic infrastructure of a state that had classified a portion of its population as subhuman and had been systematically removing them from every protection that civil society ordinarily provides. The historian Christopher Browning has described the period from 1933 to 1941 as a process of cumulative radicalization, each step making the next step not only possible, but within the internal logic of the regime, seemingly necessary. That logic would reach its most terrible expression in the summer and autumn of 1941. Chapter 5: Operation Barbarossa and the Beginning of Mass Murder. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, along a front stretching roughly 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It was the largest land invasion in military history. Approximately 3 million German troops advanced into Soviet territory alongside Hungarian, Romanian, Slovak, and Italian forces. The stated military objective was the rapid defeat of the Soviet Union before winter, a goal that Hitler and much of the German high command believed would be achieved within weeks. What they launched instead was a 4-year campaign that would kill an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens and ultimately contribute decisively to Germany's own defeat. But for the history of the Holocaust, Barbarossa was not primarily a military event. It was a turning point in the trajectory of mass murder. Hitler framed the invasion explicitly as a war of extermination, a Vernichtungskrieg, against what he called Jewish Bolshevism. The ideological equation of Jews with communism was not a peripheral feature of Nazi thinking, it was central. In Hitler's worldview, the Soviet system was a Jewish creation, and defeating it required not merely military victory, but the elimination of the Jewish population of occupied Soviet territory. This was not improvised. It was planned. The Einsatzgruppen, 4 mobile killing units designated A, B, C, and D, moved into Soviet territory behind the advancing German army with explicit instructions to kill Soviet Jewish state and party officials. These units, each comprising roughly 500 to 1,000 men, operated in coordination with Wehrmacht security forces, border police battalions, and local collaborators recruited from Lithuanian, Latvian, Ukrainian, and other nationalist groups who had their own reasons, ranging from genuine anti-Semitism to the desire for material gain to simple opportunism. For participating, the killings began within days of the invasion's start. In the first weeks, the targets were primarily adult male Jews who had worked as civil servants, Communist Party members, or in positions requiring education. This targeting profile was ideologically coherent within the regime's framework. These were the men deemed most likely to organize resistance. But by July and August of 1941, Heinrich Himmler, who made several visits to the killing squad's zones of operation, personally observing operations and relaying instructions to expand the scope, directed that Jewish women and children be included in the killings. The decision was not made in a single directive. It was reached incrementally, under the pressure of Himmler's authority and the ideological framework that had been building for years. The killing sites followed a pattern. Victims were rounded up, marched to locations typically a few kilometers outside a town, forced to undress, and shot into previously excavated pits. Some of the pits had been dug by Jewish men the day before their own execution. The executions were frequently public. Local non-Jewish populations watched, in some cases participated in the looting of victims' belongings. In Latvia and Lithuania especially, local nationalist militia groups conducted pogroms even before the German forces fully arrived, killing tens of thousands of Jews in the first weeks of the occupation. The Babi Yar ravine outside Kiev was the site of one of the most recorded individual massacres. Over 2 days at the end of September 1941, 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were shot by German security police and local Ukrainian auxiliary police. The number is taken from the perpetrator's own operational report. It is one of the few instances in this history where the killers were meticulous enough in their documentation to provide a figure that scholars have been unable to significantly dispute. By the end of 1941, the 3,000 men of the Einsatzgruppen had proven insufficient to the scale of killing demanded by their mandate. Himmler mobilized 21 battalions of order police, men who were not members of the SS, not ideological fanatics by training, but regular policemen, to assist with the shootings. Historian Christopher Browning's landmark 1992's study Ordinary Men examined one such unit, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and its findings were disturbing in precisely the way this history requires us to engage with. Most of the men in the battalion were middle-aged, working-class Germans who had joined the order police before the war. Their commanding officer explicitly told them, at the beginning of their killing operations, that older men who did not feel capable of carrying out the shootings could step aside. Very few did. The men who killed were not primarily SS fanatics. They were policemen with wives and children at home, men embedded in ordinary life, men who chose, day after day, to continue. The Action T4 program, the systematic murder of Germans with mental or physical disabilities, had been underway since 1939, killing approximately 70,000 institutionalized people, including all 4,000 to 5,000 institutionalized Jews, in specialized facilities using poison gas. Hitler ordered a halt to the centralized program in August 1941, after knowledge of the killings leaked out, and Catholic bishops publicly protested. But the personnel, the technology, and the operational knowledge gained from T4 did not disappear. The same men who had developed and operated the gassing facilities were subsequently redeployed to a new project in occupied Poland, a project whose scale would dwarf anything that had come before. By late autumn of 1941, more than 80% of the Jews in central Ukraine, eastern Belarus, Russia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been shot. Somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million Jews were killed in this phase of the Holocaust, by bullets in open fields, in forests, at the edges of rivers. This was, on its own terms, a genocide of historic proportions. And yet, in the architecture of what the Nazi regime was planning, it was only the beginning, because the killings by Einsatzgruppen were messy, localized, and dependent on thousands of individual shooters who, as Himmler himself observed after watching an execution, were experiencing psychological strain from the nature of their work. A more efficient method was being constructed, and it would operate on an industrial scale. Chapter 6, the Wannsee Conference and the Final Solution. On the 20th of January, 1942, 15 senior officials of the Nazi German government and the SS gathered at a villa on the Wannsee Lake in the southwest suburbs of Berlin. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. Lunch was served. The men around the table represented the various arms of German state power: the Foreign Office, the Justice Ministry, the Occupied Territories Administration, and the SS security apparatus. The purpose of the meeting was not to decide whether to murder all of Europe's Jews. That decision, historians now broadly agree, had already been made. The Wannsee Conference was called to coordinate how. The conference was organized by Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, and the minutes, discovered after the war in the Foreign Office archives, are one of the most clinical documents in human history. Written in the careful euphemistic language that Nazi bureaucracy favored, they refer to evacuation, special treatment, and the final solution to the Jewish question. But the meaning was not ambiguous to the men in that room. The minutes record Heydrich informing attendees that approximately 11 million Jews across all of Europe, including countries not yet under German control, were to be addressed as part of this solution. The document included a table listing Jewish population figures, country by country, from France with 350,000 to Estonia with approximately 5,000. It was the administrative framing of a continent-wide genocide. Historians debate precisely when Hitler made the final decision to murder all of Europe's Jews. Some point to the declaration he made to Nazi Party leadership on the 12th of December, 1941, the day after declaring war on the United States, when he reportedly said that the world war is here. The annihilation of the Jews must be the necessary consequence. Some see the decision as emerging more gradually through 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union as its crucial accelerant. The so-called intentionalist historians, who argue that Hitler had a preformed plan for genocide that he always intended to implement, and the functionalist historians, who argue that the genocide emerged from the chaotic and competing pressures of the wartime bureaucracy, have been debating this question for 50 years. The current historiographical consensus, described by scholars as a synthesis position, holds that Hitler's ideological commitment to the destruction of European Jews was long-standing and fundamental, but that the specific mechanisms of implementation evolved under the pressures of wartime and were shaped by initiative at multiple levels of the Nazi hierarchy simultaneously. Beginning in late 1941 and accelerating through 1942, the Nazi regime began constructing a network of purpose-built extermination facilities in occupied Poland. These were distinct from the concentration camps, which had been in operation since 1933. Distinct because their primary function was not detention or forced labor, but killing. The first was Chelmno, established in the Warthland in December 1941, which used gas vans, sealed vehicles into which victims were forced and killed by engine exhaust, killing approximately 150,000 people. Then came Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, 3 camps built as part of a program known as Operation Reinhard, named after Reinhard Heydrich after his assassination by Czech resistance fighters in May 1942. Together, the 3 Operation Reinhard camps killed approximately 1.7 million Jews between the spring of 1942 and autumn of 1943. Auschwitz-Birkenau is the most recognized name in this history, and for reason. It was the largest single killing site of the Holocaust. Originally established in May 1940 as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, Auschwitz expanded enormously after 1941. Its second subcamp, Birkenau, designated Auschwitz II, became the primary killing facility, ultimately equipped with 4 large crematoria that incorporated gas chambers capable of killing more than 1,000 people within an hour. Experiments with Zyklon B, hydrogen cyanide pellets, were conducted on Soviet prisoners of war in August and September of 1941. By the following year, Zyklon B had become the standard killing technology at Auschwitz. Between 900,000 and 1 million Jews were killed at Auschwitz-Birkenau over the course of its operation. The precise number will never be known with certainty because the Nazis destroyed records before the camp's liberation. The deportations that fed these camps required the apparatus of the German state to function in an integrated, coordinated way across occupied Europe. Jews were arrested by local police, often non-German, concentrated in transit camps, and transported by rail in sealed freight cars. The transport system was managed by the Reich Main Security Office, in coordination with the German Railway Authority, which designated the trains that carried victims to extermination camps as commercial freight shipments. Adolf Eichmann, the SS functionary who coordinated Jewish deportations across Europe, oversaw the logistics from his office in Vienna and Berlin with bureaucratic efficiency. The trains that arrived at Auschwitz were met by SS doctors and inmates, who conducted selections on the platform. Those deemed fit for forced labor were directed to one side, those deemed unfit. The elderly, children, pregnant women, and the sick were directed to the other. Those directed to the second group were told they would shower and receive clean clothing. They were taken to the gas chambers. The scale of the murder during 1942 demands to be stated plainly. Historians estimate that more than 3 million Jews were killed in that single year, the majority of them in a concentrated period of months during the summer and autumn as the Operation Reinhard camps reached their maximum operational capacity. It was the peak of the killing. Of all the Jews who died in the Holocaust, approximately 20 to 25% were already dead by early 1942. Another 20 to 25% survived to see the end of the war. The remaining 50 to 60%, roughly 3 million people, died between early 1942 and the end of the war in May 1945, with the greatest concentration of deaths in 1942. The Wannsee Conference and the system it coordinated are sometimes taught as the beginning of the Holocaust. They were not the beginning. They were the systematization of something already underway. The point at which a regime that had been moving toward mass murder for 9 years decided to make it comprehensive and continent-wide. Understanding this is critical because it prevents us from locating the origin of genocide in a single room, on a single morning, in a comfortable villa by a lake. It forces us to look further back, across years of legislation and bureaucratic dehumanization, and to ask the question that the historian Yehuda Bauer has framed as central to understanding not just the Holocaust, but the possibility of future genocides. At what point, exactly in the sequence of small steps and incremental decisions, should someone have said no? Chapter 7. The Deportations. Europe's Jews on the Move. There is a particular kind of horror in logistics, not the horror of violence, which is immediate and comprehensible in its brutality, but the horror of a spreadsheet, of a name on a list in a folder in a filing cabinet in a regional office of the Reich Security Main Office, a folder that would eventually become a transport number that would become a train that would arrive at a platform in occupied Poland. The deportations of European Jews between 1942 and 1944 were not the work of a handful of fanatics. They were the work of a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies, by design, distribute moral responsibilities so finely across so many desks that no individual feels the full weight of what the system is doing. That is precisely how they work. That is precisely why they are dangerous. The deportation program required 3 things to function: a population registry that identified who was Jewish, a police apparatus that could arrest and concentrate those people, and a transport system that could move them. In every country that contributed to the deportations, and many did, at least one of these 3 elements was provided by the local administrations rather than the German occupiers themselves. In France, the Vichy government had its own racial laws predating German pressure, and its own police force, the milice, that conducted roundups. In the Netherlands, the extraordinarily comprehensive Dutch Civil Registry, one of the most detailed in Europe, made it possible for the German Occupation Authority and its Dutch administrative partners to identify virtually every Jewish resident in the country with bureaucratic precision. In Slovakia and Croatia, the local governments deported Jews using their own authority, sometimes before the Germans had even formally requested it. The French deportations illustrate both the complexity and the complicity of this process. In July 1942, the Velodrome Diver Roundup in Paris, known by its abbreviated name, the Vel-Div, saw approximately 13,000 Jews, including more than 4,000 children, arrested by French police over 2 days and held in a cycling stadium in conditions of catastrophic overcrowding and deprivation before being transferred to transit camps and ultimately to Auschwitz. French police officers conducted these arrests, without German officers present in most cases. For decades after the war, the French state maintained that Vichy France and the French Republic were separate entities, and that the Republic bore no responsibility for Vichy's crimes. It was not until July 1995, in a speech delivered by President Jacques Chirac, that the French Republic formally acknowledged the guilt of the French state for its role in the deportations. That acknowledgement took 50 years. The children who were arrested at the Vel d'Eve did not have 50 years. In the Netherlands, approximately 107,000 of 140,000 Dutch Jews were deported and killed, a mortality rate of roughly 75%, one of the highest in Western Europe. The reasons for this extraordinarily high rate remain debated among historians, but contributing factors include the flat geography of the Netherlands that made hiding difficult, the efficiency of the Dutch civil registry, the comparatively organized and cooperative response of the Dutch Jewish leadership in early stages of the occupation, and the particular ideological commitment of the SS and police forces assigned to the Netherlands under Arthur Seyss-Inquart. The Dutch case is also notable because it was here that a teenage girl named Anne Frank and her family went into hiding in a concealed apartment, what she called the secret annex, in August 1942. She kept a diary. She was discovered in August 1944. She was transported to Auschwitz and then to Bergen-Belsen, where she died in late February or early March 1945, approximately 2 to 3 months before the camp was liberated. She was 15 years old. In the East, the deportations from the remaining ghettos proceeded with the explicit aim of total liquidation. The Warsaw Ghetto deportations began on the 22nd of July, 1942, a date the community remembered as the Great Action. Within approximately 2 months, between 250,000 and 300,000 people had been transported from Warsaw to the Treblinka extermination camp, where they were killed upon or very shortly after arrival. The deportations were managed in part through a catastrophic deception. Arriving deportees were told they were being sent to resettlement in the East, to labor camps, to new lives. Hunger was a tool. Early in the deportations, the Jewish Council in Warsaw offered food rations to Jews who voluntarily reported for deportation. People were so hungry after 2 years in the ghetto that some came forward. By the time the scale of what was happening became undeniable to those remaining in the ghetto, the mass of the community had already been deported and killed. The Hungarian deportations of 1944 represent the single most concentrated and rapid mass murder operation of the entire Holocaust. Hungary, an Axis ally, had maintained its Jewish population of approximately 750,000 people, the largest surviving Jewish community in occupied Europe by that point, under domestic discrimination, but without deportation, under considerable German pressure. When Germany occupied Hungary directly in March 1944, citing fears that Hungary was negotiating a separate peace, the situation changed overnight. Adolf Eichmann personally travelled to Budapest to oversee the deportations. In a period of approximately 56 days, between mid-May and early July 1944, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The crematoria at Birkenau were operating at maximum capacity. At peak operation, the killing rate at Auschwitz-Birkenau during the Hungarian deportations has been estimated at approximately 10,000 people per day. This speed, this industrial throughput applied to human lives, had consequences even within Auschwitz's own killing infrastructure. The crematoria could not keep pace. Bodies were burned in open pits. The Sonderkommando, the prisoner work squads, predominantly Jewish, who were forced to operate the crematoria under threat of immediate execution, worked in conditions of psychological extremity that are almost impossible to describe adequately. Several members of the Sonderkommando kept secret notes that they buried near the crematoria. Some of these were recovered after the war. They wrote because they understood that what was happening needed witnesses, and they had no other way to bear witness. The historian Gideon Graefe conducted extensive interviews with surviving Sonderkommando members in the 1980s and 1990s. Their testimonies are among the most direct accounts we have of the operational reality inside the gas chambers and crematoria. Graefe's work is important precisely because it refuses to make these men either heroes or villains. They were people placed in a situation of impossible coercion, and what they did and what they witnessed must be understood on those terms. The railway system that made continental deportations possible operated under a combination of German state authority and mundane commercial logistics. The German Railway Authority, Reichsbahn, designated deportation trains as special movements alongside normal freight traffic. Local station masters at intermediate points processed the train's passage. Railway workers who understood what the trains contained could, and occasionally did, look the other way when information leaked through the system. In Italy, where the deportation of Jews began after the German occupation of the North in September 1943, railway workers in some areas deliberately delayed deportation trains, allowing some Jews additional time to escape. In other areas, they did not. The railway is one of the places where the history of the Holocaust most clearly becomes a history of individual choices. Thousands of individual choices made in specific moments by specific people that together determined who lived and who died. The deportations were not merely the transport of a population to its death. They were at every stage a deliberate process of humiliation and dehumanization. Deportees were told to bring a small amount of luggage, the implication being that they were moving somewhere. They were crowded into freight cars designed for cattle, in numbers and conditions that ensured that a significant percentage would die before reaching their destination simply from the journey. Water was rarely provided. Journeys that covered several hundred kilometers could take several days. When the trains arrived at Auschwitz and the doors were opened, the SS personnel who met them described the condition of the arrivals: the thirst, the exhaustion, the deaths that had occurred in transit. With clinical detachment in their operational reports, the reports used measurements and numbers. They did not use names. By the end of 1943, approximately 3 million Polish Jews had been killed. The Operation Reinhard camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, had largely completed their work and were being dismantled. The Nazis planted trees over the killing sites and built farm structures over the pits to conceal what had happened there. Former Ukrainian guards were transferred to assist with anti-partisan operations in Italy. The attempt to physically erase the evidence of the killing sites was not entirely successful. Sobibor survivor testimonies, combined with archaeological excavations conducted between 2011 and 2014, have confirmed the presence of mass graves covering an area far larger than the original surface evidence suggested. The earth remembers what the perpetrators tried to hide. Chapter 8. Resistance. Those who fought back for decades after the war. A damaging and historically illiterate myth circulated about the victims of the Holocaust. The accusation, often phrased as an incredulous question, of why they went like sheep to the slaughter. It is a phrase that does almost everything wrong that a historical claim can do. It blames the murdered for their own murder. It ignores the specific conditions of coercion, deception, and systematic disarmament that victims faced. And it is, as a matter of historical record, factually inaccurate. Resistance to the Holocaust was widespread, diverse, and extraordinary under the circumstances. And the circumstances were, To put it plainly, among the most extreme that human beings have ever faced. Understanding resistance in the Holocaust requires first understanding what resistance meant when you had no weapons, no outside allies, no safe territory, no legal standing, and when the penalty for any act of defiance was immediate death, sometimes extending to your entire family and community. Resistance took many forms, most of them invisible in the conventional military sense. Maintaining cultural and religious life in the ghettos was resistance. In Warsaw, Krakow, Vilna, and dozens of other ghettos, underground schools operated clandestinely after the Germans closed Jewish educational institutions. Teachers taught children in apartments, in basement rooms, in whatever space could be found. Theatrical performances were organized. Literary circles met in secret. The Oneg Shabbat archive in Warsaw, organized by historian Emanuel Ringelblum and a group of collaborators, systematically documented ghetto life by collecting testimonies, official documents, yes, diaries and cultural materials in sealed milk cans that were buried beneath the ghetto before the deportations. 2 of the 3 buried caches were recovered after the war. Ringelblum himself was murdered in March 1944. Weeks before the end of the German occupation, his archive survived. Armed resistance in the ghettos faced near impossible material conditions. The Germans had systematically disarmed the Jewish population. Obtaining a single pistol required connections, money, and enormous risk. The Jewish underground in Warsaw, the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, or Jewish Combat Organization, spent months acquiring weapons through purchase, theft, and contact with the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, which provided limited assistance. By the time the Germans began the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, in the spring of 1943, the Jewish Combat Organization had gathered roughly 500 fighters, with a few hundred pistols, several rifles, and a small number of improvised grenades and incendiary bottles. Against this, the Germans deployed regular SS troops, Waffen-SS cavalry, police units, engineering teams, and eventually artillery and flamethrowers. The military asymmetry was total. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began on the 19th of April, 1943, the first night of Passover, when German forces entered the ghetto to complete its liquidation. They were met with armed resistance from concealed positions. The fighters knew they could not win in any conventional military sense. Mordecai Anielewicz, the 23-year-old commander of the Jewish Combat Organization, wrote in a letter that the uprising's purpose was to die with dignity rather than to be deported to Treblinka. The Germans expected to complete the operation in 3 days. The fighting continued for approximately 4 weeks, until SS General Jürgen Stroop ordered a systematic, block-by-block burning of the ghetto. Anielewicz and the surviving core of the command group died when their command bunker at Miła 18 was surrounded. Stroop filed a report to his superiors with the title, "The Jewish Residential District of Warsaw is no more," illustrated with photographs. That report was introduced as evidence at the Nuremberg trials and is one of the most extensively analyzed perpetrator documents in Holocaust scholarship. Resistance also erupted within the extermination camps themselves. Perhaps the most astonishing acts of defiance in this entire history, because the conditions inside these facilities made any organized action almost unimaginably difficult. At Treblinka, on the 2nd of August, 1943, a group of prisoner workers staged an uprising, setting fire to camp structures and storming the perimeter fence. Approximately 300 prisoners escaped. The vast majority were recaptured and killed in the following days. Perhaps 40 to 70 survived to see liberation. At Sobibor, on the 14th of October 1943, a group of Soviet Jewish prisoners of war, led by Lieutenant Alexander Pachersky, organized the killing of several SS officers in rapid succession, and then led approximately 300 prisoners in a mass escape through the camp fence. Pechersky himself survived and wrote a memoir. Approximately 50 to 60 of the Sobibor escapees survived the war. The Sobibor uprising has been recognized by historians as the single most successful prisoner revolt in the history of the Nazi camp system. The Auschwitz Sonderkommando revolt of the 7th of October, 1944, came when the Sonderkommando learned that they were about to be killed and replaced, as happened periodically, to prevent witnesses from surviving. Using gunpowder smuggled in small quantities by Jewish women workers in the Auschwitz armaments factory. Women who knew they would almost certainly be executed if caught. The Sonderkommando managed to blow up Crematorium 4, partially destroying it. The uprising was suppressed quickly. All of the participants were killed. 4 of the women who had smuggled the gunpowder, Rosa Robota, Esther Weichblum, Regina Saffestein, and Alla Gärtner, were publicly hanged in the Auschwitz women's camp in January 1945. Their names are in the record. They should be said aloud. Beyond the ghettos and the camps, Jewish partisan activity in the forests of Eastern Europe was significant in scale and consequence. In the forests of Belarus, Lithuania, and Ukraine, Jewish partisan groups, some all Jewish, others integrated with Soviet or Polish partisan movements, conducted sabotage operations, attacked German supply lines, and rescued Jews from the ghettos. The Bielski partisans, led by Tuvia Bielski, operated in the forests of what is now western Belarus, and at their peak sheltered more than 1,200 Jewish men, women, and children, making their group one of the most successful Jewish rescue operations of the war. The Bielski unit was not merely a fighting force, it was a forest community with workshops, schools, and medical facilities, functioning in winter conditions of extraordinary hardship. The argument that Jewish resistance was passive or non-existent is not merely historically incorrect. It is an insult to the memory of everyone who fought back under conditions that most people who ask the question, why didn't they fight, have never remotely approached. The response of the surrounding populations to Jewish persecution ranged from active participation in killings at one extreme to extraordinary risk-taking rescue at the other. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, has recognized more than 28,000 non-Jewish individuals from 51 countries as righteous among the nations, people who risked their own lives to save Jews. Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat in Budapest, who issued tens of thousands of protective Swedish passports to Hungarian Jews and established safe houses in the city, rescued an estimated tens of thousands of people before being arrested by Soviet forces in January 1945, never to be seen again publicly. Nicholas Winton organized the transport of approximately 669 predominantly Jewish children from Czechoslovakia to Britain in the months before the war, an operation not publicly known until his wife discovered a scrapbook in their attic in 1988. Oskar Schindler, the German industrialist, used his munitions factory in Krakow as cover to protect approximately 1,200 Jewish workers from deportation and death. What distinguishes the rescuers as a historical category is not that they possessed unusual courage as a character trait, most described in later interviews, not feeling particularly brave at the time, but that they made a different choice when confronted with the same circumstances that led most people to look away. The psychologist Nechama Tek, who studied rescuers in Poland extensively, found that the most consistent variable distinguishing rescuers from bystanders was not religion, or class, or education level, but a particular kind of independence, a degree of psychological separation from the expectations of their social group that allowed them to act on individual moral judgment rather than social conformity. This finding is simultaneously hopeful and unsettling. Hopeful because it suggests rescue was a choice available to many more people than chose it. and unsettling for exactly the same reason. The history of resistance in the Holocaust needs to be recovered from two simultaneous distortions. One distortion minimizes it, perpetuating the sheep myth and implying that the victims bore some share of responsibility for their fate by not fighting hard enough. The other distortion mythologizes it, presenting the resistors as superhuman figures of heroism that inadvertently makes ordinary survival seem insufficient. The truth is more useful and more human than either distortion. Resistance happened, in many forms, in many places, by many people, under conditions of almost total powerlessness. It did not change the ultimate outcome for the majority of those who resisted, but it was real, it was meaningful, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. Not as comfort and not as mythology, but as what it actually was. Human beings refusing, whenever and however they could, to cooperate with their own erasure. Chapter 9. The World That Watched. Bystanders, Allies, and Information. By the summer of 1942, the British government knew. By the autumn of 1942, the American government knew. Not in fragments, not in rumors, but with sufficient documentary and testimonial evidence to understand that a systematic program of mass murder of European Jews was underway at an industrial scale. On the 17th of December 1942, the governments of the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and 9 governments in exile issued a joint declaration condemning, in the strongest possible terms, the bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination. The declaration named Jews specifically. It promised post-war accountability. It was read into the record of the British House of Commons, after which members rose spontaneously in a moment of silence, a gesture that had no precedent in the Commons' history. And then, largely, the governments returned to their other business. How the Allied governments obtained knowledge of the systematic killings is a story that is itself worth understanding in detail. Jan Karski, a courier for the Polish underground, entered the Warsaw Ghetto and a transit camp near Izbica Lubelska in the summer of 1942, witnessed conditions and killing operations directly, and then carried eyewitness reports to London and Washington. He met with senior British Foreign Office officials, with members of the Polish government in exile, and eventually with President Roosevelt himself in July 1943. Roosevelt listened, asked questions about the general Polish situation, and then moved on to other topics. He did not follow up specifically on the extermination program. Karski later said that the magnitude of what he was describing simply did not seem to be fully received, that there was a psychological resistance in his listeners to accepting information that did not fit within any existing frame of reference they possessed. The Regner telegram, sent in August 1942 by Gerhard Regner of the World Jewish Congress from Geneva to the British and American governments, reported information obtained from a German industrialist that Hitler had ordered the extermination of all Jews in German-controlled Europe, and that a killing program using prussic acid was being implemented. The American State Department initially withheld the telegram from its intended recipient, Rabbi Stephen Wise, and advised the British Foreign Office not to act on it. It was not until November 1942 that Wise was permitted to make the contents public, after he had obtained corroborating information through other channels. The State Department's handling of the Regner telegram became, in subsequent decades, one of the most examined examples of institutional indifference, perhaps culpable indifference, in American bureaucratic history. The question of why the Allies did not bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz or the crematoria at Birkenau has been debated by historians and policymakers for decades. By the summer of 1944, when the Hungarian deportations were at their peak, American and British aircraft were flying raids on industrial targets within a relatively short distance of Auschwitz-Birkenau. oil refineries at Blehammer and Monowitz, which was literally Auschwitz III, a sub-camp of the Auschwitz complex, were bombed repeatedly. Photographs taken by Allied reconnaissance aircraft of the Monowitz industrial area inadvertently captured images of the Birkenau crematoria in June and August of 1944. These photographs were analysed by intelligence officers who identified the crematoria structures and the prisoner selection platform, but did not specifically recommend bombing them. Jewish organizations submitted explicit requests to Allied governments to bomb the rail lines to Auschwitz. The British Air Ministry rejected the request on the grounds that it would be ineffective and divert resources from other operations. The American War Department similarly declined. Whether bombing the rail lines or the crematoria would have significantly reduced. The death toll is genuinely debated by military historians. The infrastructure could have been repaired, alternative routes existed. The Hungarian deportations were by that point nearly complete. But the decision was made without genuine engagement with the moral question being posed. The available record suggests the requests were processed bureaucratically rather than engaged with seriously. The Catholic Church's wartime conduct is among the most contested chapters in the historiography of the Bastender response. Pope Pius XII, who had been papal nuncio in Germany during the Weimar years, and Pope since 1939, never issued a direct public condemnation, naming the extermination of Jews as a crime. He was aware of the killings through Vatican diplomatic channels and through direct reports from Catholic clergy in occupied Poland. He chose, consistently, a policy of what he and his defenders characterized as quiet diplomacy, private expressions of concern through diplomatic channels, with the calculation that public condemnation would provoke German reprisals against Catholics in occupied territories and reduce what influence the Vatican might exercise. His critics, beginning with Rolf Hochschild's play The Representative in 1963, have argued that a clear public condemnation from the most powerful moral authority in the Catholic world could have significantly influenced the behavior of Catholic perpetrators and bystanders in countries like France, Slovakia, Croatia, and Hungary. The debate is genuinely unresolved. The historical record shows both that individual Catholics, priests, and members of religious orders risked and sometimes gave their lives to rescue Jews, and that the institutional leadership of the Church chose silence at the moment when its voice would have carried the most weight. In the United States, the political constraints on a more forceful refugee response included genuine public anti-Semitism, immigration restrictionism codified in the 1924 Immigration Act, and a political calculation by the Roosevelt administration that any appearance of fighting for the Jews would be used by isolationists to undermine public support for the war effort. Roosevelt was also concerned about Soviet sensitivities. Stalin had shown no particular interest in highlighting Jewish suffering, as distinct from the broader Soviet civilian losses, which were incomparably larger in absolute numbers. In January 1944, after Treasury Department official Josiah Du Bois compiled a damning internal report titled Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr. brought it directly to Roosevelt. Within weeks, Roosevelt established the War Refugee Board, which, in the remaining year of the war, contributed to the rescue of an estimated 200,000 Jewish lives through funding rescue operations in Hungary and Romania. The War Refugee Board was established in January 1944. The systematic killing had been documented by the American government since the autumn of 1942. That gap of more than a year represents, in the War Refugee Board's own later assessments, an unknown number of lives that might have been saved. The neutral countries Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey each played complex roles in the wartime drama. Switzerland accepted approximately 25,000 Jewish refugees, but turned back an estimated 24,000 at its borders. And Swiss border guards were provided explicit instructions that Jewish refugees fleeing racial persecution did not qualify for asylum under Swiss law. At the same time, Switzerland provided banking services and negotiated arrangements that some historians argue extended German economic capacity. Sweden maintained its policy of neutrality through most of the war, trading iron ore with Germany while quietly expanding its absorption of Jewish refugees, particularly from Norway and Denmark, and eventually hosting the Wallenberg mission in Budapest. The moral and political choices made by neutral nations have received increasing scrutiny from historians in recent decades as the full documentary record has become available. The response of Arab and Middle Eastern political leadership to the Holocaust varied considerably and remains an area of significant historiographical attention, particularly given the post-war migration of Holocaust survivors to British Mandatory Palestine. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, met with Hitler in Berlin in November 1941 and expressed support for German policies against Jews in Europe and the Middle East. His influence on the actual conduct of the Holocaust was minimal, but his collaboration with the Nazi regime has been a persistent subject of political and historical debate in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Most Arab political figures had no meaningful engagement with the Holocaust's implementation and the Holocaust's effects on the political shape of the Middle East. Through the increased urgency of Zionist immigration to Palestine and the eventual establishment of Israel in 1948, played out primarily after the war's end. The concept of the bystander in Holocaust historiography is not simply about governments. It extends to every level of social organization, to neighbors who watched deportations from their windows, to railway workers who processed transport documents, to pharmaceutical companies that supplied materials, to corporations that used prisoner labor from the camp system. The German historian Götz Ali, in his provocative study, Hitler's Beneficiaries, argued that a significant portion of the German population materially benefited from the looting of Jewish property and assets, and that this material stake in anti-Semitic policy contributed to popular acquiescence. His thesis is debated, but the underlying data, that the property of murdered Jews flowed in many directions, through many hands, into many pockets, is documented. This is not comfortable history, but it is the actual history, and it demands engagement rather than avoidance. The bystander problem is ultimately not a comfortable category, because it does not stay safely in the past. The question that Holocaust bystander history poses to anyone who studies it seriously is not, why did those people in that era fail to act? The question is a mirror. What conditions of habituation, convenience, social pressure, and moral compartmentalization exist right now, in your own time and context, that allow ordinary people to be bystanders to suffering they have the power to acknowledge and the potential to address? The Holocaust does not offer easy analogies, and it does not license casual comparisons, but it does, irreducibly, ask something of the people who study it. Chapter 10, The Camps, Life and Death Inside the System. When the subject of concentration camps arises in discussions of the Holocaust, most people visualize a specific image. The brick gate tower at Auschwitz I, the words Arbeit macht frei in iron letters above the entrance. That image, repeated in photographs and documentaries for 80 years, is accurate in what it shows and deeply incomplete in what it implies. The camp system that the Nazi state constructed between 1933 and 1945 was not a single type of institution. It was an ecosystem, a vast, evolving, internally differentiated network of facilities that served different functions at different times and were connected by the administrative structure of the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, the agency that nominally managed the camps from 1942 onward. Understanding the camp systems means understanding its diversity as well as its horror. The SS concentration camp system, by the end of the war, encompassed more than 1,000 distinct facilities. Main camps, sub-camps, satellite labor camps, transit camps, PLBU camps administered by the SS, and purpose-built extermination centers. The original purpose of the concentration camp, as established at Dachau in 1933, was political detention and what the Nazi regime euphemistically called protective custody. The early inmates were communists, trade union officials, journalists, clergy, and political opponents. Jews were targeted as a community beginning in earnest from the Kristallnacht arrests of November 1938, when approximately 30,000 Jewish men were temporarily detained in Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Most were released within weeks upon proof of plans to emigrate. The camps in this early phase were instruments of terror and political control. They had not yet become the industrialized killing facilities of the wartime period. By 1942, with the implementation of the final solution, a significant portion of the camp system's function had shifted toward economic exploitation of prisoner labor, alongside extermination, the IG. Farben Corporation, one of Germany's largest chemical conglomerates, built a synthetic rubber plant, the Buna Works, at a site adjacent to Auschwitz, specifically to exploit prisoner labor from the camp. The arrangement was not forced on the corporation. IG. Farben executives selected the Auschwitz site in part because of the available prisoner labor supply and negotiated the terms of prisoner rental with the SS. Prisoners who were too sick or weak to work were returned to the SS and typically killed. IG. Farben executives later stood trial at Nuremberg, where several were convicted. The corporation itself survived the war, was divided by the Allies, and its successor companies, including Bayer, BASF, and Hoechst, became major post-war industrial enterprises. The physical conditions in the main concentration camps during the wartime years have been documented through survivor testimony, perpetrator records, and post-war forensic investigation in extraordinary detail. Prisoners at Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Neuengamme, and the other large camps received food rations calibrated over time to produce slow starvation. Enough calories to sustain labor for weeks or months, but not to maintain health over extended periods. Infectious diseases, including typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis, spread through severely overcrowded barracks with inadequate sanitation. Medical care was almost non-existent for prisoners, though the camp system maintained medical facilities that were used for something far more sinister. Human experimentation conducted by SS physicians, primarily at Auschwitz and Dachau. The human experimentation programs conducted at Auschwitz by SS physician Josef Mengele and others, and at Dachau by Sigmund Rascher, are among the most disturbing elements of the camp system's history. At Dachau, prisoners were subjected to high-altitude decompression experiments and hypothermia experiments conducted at the request of the Luftwaffe and the German Navy, seeking information about the physiology of downed air crews. At Auschwitz, Mengele conducted experiments on twins in an effort to understand genetics and achieve accelerated population engineering for the Nazi racial state. Prisoners who survived experimentation were frequently killed afterward to prevent testimony. The data obtained through these experiments, conducted on people who had no capacity to consent or refuse, was for decades an ethically contested question in medicine. Several post-war researchers used portions of the data in their own publications before the full circumstances of its collection were publicly understood. The current position of medical ethics is that data obtained through experimentation on people without consent under conditions of coercion is ethically inadmissible regardless of its scientific content. The social world inside the camps was more complex than the imagery of undifferentiated victimhood suggests. Not because the camps were anything other than what they were, but because human beings create social structures under all conditions. There were prisoner hierarchies enforced by the SS through the appointment of capos, prisoner supervisors, often with substantial authority over the life and death of those under them. Block elders managed barrack allocation and distribution of food. Some prisoner functionaries used their positions to protect fellow inmates, providing additional food, warning of selections, falsifying documents. Others exploited their positions brutally. The dynamics of prisoner collaboration with the camp system is one of the most ethically fraught areas of Holocaust scholarship, demanding the same refusal to impose simple moral frameworks that we apply to the Judenräte. The extermination camps, Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, were architecturally distinct from the concentration camps in one fundamental respect. The majority of people who arrived at them were not registered as prisoners. They were taken directly from the arriving transports and killed within hours. At Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, the vast majority of arrivals never entered the camp as prisoners in any meaningful sense. They passed from the unloading platform through a path that the SS staff at Treblinka mockingly called the Schlauch, or tube, directly to the killing facilities. Survivors from these camps are extraordinarily few in number, precisely because survival was so rarely possible. The testimony of Chill Rajman, who survived Treblinka as a prisoner worker, and of Thomas Blatt and Philip Beilowitz, who survived the Sobibor uprising, are among the small number of direct witness accounts from inside the Operation Reinhard camps. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the scale and duration of operations produced a prisoner community of hundreds of thousands of people over the course of the camp's wartime operation, and a survivor community that has been, comparatively, large enough to provide a substantial body of testimony. Elie Wiesel arrived at Auschwitz from Hungary in May 1944. Primo Levi arrived from Italy in February 1944. Viktor Frankl arrived from Vienna. Imre Kertész arrived from Budapest. What these survivors wrote afterward, Wiesel's Night, Levi's If This Is a Man, Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Kertész's Fatelessness, constitutes a body of literature that is simultaneously memoir, testimony, and philosophical meditation. Their survival was not the result of superior resourcefulness, or will, as is sometimes implied. It was, in large part, the result of contingent circumstances. Assignment to work rather than the gas chamber, the timing of illness, which SS officer happened to conduct which selection. Primo Levi wrote about the concept of the grey zone, the morally ambiguous space between victim and perpetrator, between resistance and accommodation, with a precision that no external observer could have matched. The liberation of the camps began in the east as Soviet forces advanced westward in the autumn of 1944 and into 1945. The SS began evacuating camps in the east, force-marching prisoners westward in what became known as the Death Marches in winter conditions, shooting those who could not maintain the pace. Auschwitz was liberated by Soviet forces on the 27th of January, 1945. The Soviets found approximately 7,000 prisoners still alive, too sick to have been evacuated. They found warehouses containing approximately 800,000 items of women's clothing, approximately 370,000 items of men's clothing, and approximately 7 tons of human hair, which had been processed for industrial use. The physical evidence of the camp's operation was documented by Soviet military photographers and journalists. Some of that footage was used in the post-war trials at Nuremberg as evidence. The date of Auschwitz's liberation, the 27th of January, is now observed internationally as Holocaust Remembrance Day. The camp system was, at its deepest level, an attempt to render a population of human beings into a category of non-persons, to strip them so completely of the markers of individual identity, the names, the clothing, the hair, the personal possessions, that their deaths would register as quantities rather than as losses. The number tattooed on a prisoner's forearm at Auschwitz, replacing the name that the SS would no longer use, was the clearest single expression of this ambition. That so many survivors, when they wrote and spoke about their experience, refused this erasure, insisted on their names, their histories, their inner lives, their complexity as human beings, is itself a form of resistance that deserves recognition as such. Primo Levi's final sentence in If This Is a Man is not a cry of anguish. It is a careful, precise, unsparing act of witness. That precision is a form of courage. Chapter 11. The Jewish world that was, culture, community, and what was lost. Before we can speak adequately about what was destroyed, we have to spend some time understanding what existed. This chapter is deliberately placed here, between the history of the camps and the history of liberation, as a kind of interruption, a refusal to let the machinery of murder be the only thing we remember about European Jewish life. Because European Jewry, in the years before the Holocaust, was not a community defined by its victimhood. It was one of the most culturally productive, intellectually diverse, and internally complex civilizations in the history of the continent. To reduce it to its ending is to continue, in a different register, the dehumanization that made the ending possible. At the turn of the 20th century, approximately 9 million Jews lived in Europe, with the largest concentrations in the Russian Empire, particularly in the areas that would become Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. These communities had developed over centuries a distinctive cultural and intellectual world, organized around Yiddish as a vernacular language, Hebrew as a sacred and literary language, and, increasingly, the national languages of the countries they inhabited. The Yiddish-speaking world stretched from Warsaw to Odessa, from Vilna, sometimes called the Jerusalem of Lithuania, to the Stetlac, the small market towns of the Polish countryside, each with its own synagogues, study houses, markets, and generational memories embedded in the landscape. Vilna in the early 20th century was a particular center of Jewish intellectual life. The Great Synagogue of Vilna, built in the early 17th century, was one of the most architecturally significant Jewish houses of worship in Europe. The YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, the Jiddische Wissenschaftliche Institute, was founded in Vilna in 1925 and became the preeminent institution for the scholarly study of Yiddish language and culture, accumulating a library and archive of extraordinary scope. When German forces occupied Vilna in June 1941, the city's Jewish population of approximately 57,000 people had no warning of what was coming. By the end of 1941, approximately 33,000 had been killed at a site called Ponar, a forested area outside the city. The Great Synagogue was demolished. The YIVO archives were partially looted by German cultural officials who intended to use the materials for anti-Semitic research. Some portion of the archives survived, smuggled out in stages by Jewish prisoners, forced to work in the looting operation. An act of cultural preservation that the prisoners called, in a moment of dark poetry, the Paper Brigade. Polish Jewish culture before the war was extraordinarily diverse in its political and cultural expression. The Jewish community of interwar Poland encompassed secular Zionists who envisioned a Jewish state in Palestine, Bundists who argued that the Jewish future lay in building socialist movements within the diaspora countries, Hasidic communities organized around the authority of specific rabbinical dynasties, The Orthodox establishment of the Agudas Yisrael Party, communist activists, Polish nationalists who identified primarily as Poles, assimilated intellectuals whose primary cultural frame of reference was Polish or German or Russian literature, merchants, craftsmen, doctors, lawyers, teachers, thieves, poets, and cab drivers. There was no single Jewish experience in interwar Poland, any more than there is a single experience among any group of 3 million people living across a continent. Jewish intellectual contributions to European cultural life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were transformative across nearly every field of modern thought. Sigmund Freud's development of psychoanalysis reshaped how human beings understand themselves. Albert Einstein's theories of special and general relativity reshaped physics and, ultimately, cosmology. Franz Kafka, writing in Prague in German, produced a body of fiction that named something essential about the experience of modern bureaucratic life, which makes the particular irony of what bureaucracy ultimately did to people like him almost too precise to be accidental. Kafka died of tuberculosis in 1924 and did not live to see the Holocaust, but 3 of his sisters, Gabrielle, Valerie, and Ottilie, were murdered in it. The composer Arnold Schoenberg, the writer Stefan Zweig, the philosopher Walter Benjamin. Benjamin died in 1940 at the Spanish border while attempting to flee occupied France, taking his own life when it appeared the border was closed. The painter Marc Chagall, who did escape. These were not incidental figures in European culture. They were central to it. The world of Jewish religious scholarship in Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states represented centuries of accumulated learning that was concentrated in yeshivot, academies of Jewish law and sacred text, that trained generations of scholars. The Mir Yeshiva, one of the most prestigious in Poland, managed a remarkable escape. Its entire student body and faculty, approximately 400 people, obtained Japanese transit visas through the Dutch consul Jan Zwartendijk and the Japanese consul Chiune Sugihara in Kaunas, Lithuania, and made their way across the Soviet Union and through Kobe, Japan, to Shanghai, where they spent the war under Japanese occupation. They survived. The Mir Yeshiva is today one of the largest yeshivot in the world, located in Jerusalem and Brooklyn. The survival of its scholars, while numerically small against the scale of destruction, is one of the most extraordinary stories of institutional survival in the entire history of the war. The destruction of Jewish cultural infrastructure during the Holocaust was not incidental to the killing program. It was deliberately thorough. Synagogues were burned or demolished. Cemetery stones were used as paving material. Libraries were looted, destroyed, or shipped to Germany. Archives were burned. Torah scrolls were desecrated. The Nazis also organized the systematic looting of Jewish art collections, which were either transferred to the personal collections of Nazi leaders. Hermann Göring assembled an enormous personal collection through confiscation, or consolidated in repositories for planned display in Hitler's projected Führermuseum in Linz. The effort to recover looted Jewish cultural property and return it to heirs and communities has been ongoing since the end of the war, and continues today, with thousands of artworks still in the possession of museums, governments, and private collectors who acquired them through the wartime looting chain. What was lost cannot be quantified in any meaningful sense. We can count the dead, though even that count is approximate at its edges. We cannot count the poems not written, the music not composed, the children not born, the conversations not had, the generations whose entire existence was foreclosed. The demographic impact on Jewish life was enormous. The approximately 3 million Polish Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust represented approximately 90% of the pre-war Polish Jewish population. The communities of Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and much of Hungary were destroyed at comparable rates. The center of gravity of Jewish life, which had been in Eastern Europe for 5 centuries, shifted permanently in those years, to Israel, to North America, to the communities that survived or rebuilt in Western Europe. The cultural world that had been centered in Warsaw and Vilna and Krakow and Łódź does not exist anymore, not in diminished form, in destroyed form. The Yiddish language itself nearly died. Before the war, approximately 11 million people worldwide spoke Yiddish as a primary language. The Holocaust killed the majority of Yiddish speakers in Europe, combined with the policies of both the nascent Israeli state, which prioritized Hebrew, and the Soviet Union, which restricted Yiddish cultural expression and targeted Yiddish intellectuals in the anti-Semitic campaigns of the late Stalin years. Yiddish contracted from a living vernacular civilization to a language preserved primarily in literature, memory, and the speech of specific Hasidic communities. The effort to document, preserve, and in some contexts, revive Yiddish language and culture is a significant, ongoing scholarly and cultural project. The YIVO Institute, now based in New York, is a principal center of that work. This chapter does not end with a resolution, because the loss does not resolve. There is a word in Yiddish, cherben, that means catastrophe, destruction. It was the word the Yiddish-speaking world initially used for what had happened before Holocaust became the prevalent English term, and Shoah, the prevalent Hebrew term. Cherben carries in it something the more clinical terms perhaps do not. The sound of something broken that cannot be put back together. We carry this history not because it gives us comfort, and not because it offers clean lessons, but because the people who lived these lives deserve to be remembered as having lived, fully, complexly, irreducibly, and not merely to have died. Chapter 12. The Final Year. Death, Marches, Collapse, and Liberation. By the summer of 1944, the strategic position of the Third Reich was deteriorating with a speed that the most optimistic of Germany's enemies would not have predicted 2 years earlier. The Anglo-American invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944, had opened the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. Soviet forces had launched Operation Bagration, one of the largest military offensives of the war. In late June, driving German Army Group Center back hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks, capturing or killing somewhere in the range of 300,000 German troops. Romania and Bulgaria were about to switch sides. Finland was negotiating armistice terms. Italy had already been invaded, and the Italian Social Republic under Mussolini was a German puppet state clinging to the north. Germany was facing a two-front war that it had always known it could not win, conducted by opponents whose combined industrial capacity dwarfed its own. In this context, the SS camp administration faced a practical problem that was also an operational priority. What to do with the enormous prisoner population of the camp system as the front lines closed in? The primary concern of the SS leadership was not prisoner welfare. It was preventing prisoners from falling into Allied hands and providing testimony about what had been done to them. From this concern flowed two parallel decisions: the destruction of documentary evidence and physical evidence of the killing operations wherever possible, and the evacuation of prisoners from the camps into the German interior, where they could continue to provide forced labor for an armaments industry increasingly desperate for manpower, and where they could be killed when no longer useful. The first major evidence destruction effort had begun in the summer of 1943, when Himmler ordered the exhumation and burning of mass graves across the occupied Soviet territories as part of an operation codenamed 1005. Prisoner work squads, overwhelmingly Jewish, under direct SS supervision, were forced to exhume hundreds of thousands of bodies and burn them on enormous pyres, then to crush the remaining bones and scatter the ash. These prisoners were subsequently killed to eliminate witnesses. The scale of the erasure operation itself was enormous. Mass graves containing the victims of the Einsatzgruppen across the former Soviet occupation zone were systematically processed across multiple sites over more than a year. The attempt to erase the physical evidence of the mass shootings was only partially successful. Mass graves were subsequently located by Soviet forensic teams, by local witnesses, and in recent decades by ground-penetrating radar surveys. The death marches began as Soviet forces approached the eastern camps in the late autumn and winter of 1944 to 1945. The largest single death march movement began on the 18th of January, 1945, when approximately 60,000 Auschwitz prisoners were force-marched westward in winter conditions, some in temperatures well below 0 degrees, with inadequate clothing and food. Those who fell behind were shot by SS guards. The columns moved through Polish villages, and local Polish witnesses described seeing the marches pass. Long lines of emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms, with SS guards shooting anyone who collapsed at the roadside. Some civilians threw food to the marchers at personal risk. Most watched. The marching prisoners were taken to camps in the German interior: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Flossenburg, and Mauthausen, where the sudden influx of tens of thousands of severely weakened prisoners overwhelmed already strained facilities. Disease rates, already high, became catastrophic. Bergen-Belsen, in the heath country of Lower Saxony, had been a relatively small camp before the death march period. By early 1945, it held more than 60,000 prisoners in facilities designed for a fraction of that number. The water system had failed. Food distribution had broken down almost entirely. Typhus spread through the overcrowded barracks at a rate that killed hundreds of people per day. When British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen on the 15th of April, 1945, they found approximately 13,000 unburied bodies on the campgrounds and between 50,000 and 60,000 living prisoners, the majority severely ill. The British liberators, soldiers of the 11th Armoured Division, were unprepared for what they encountered. The BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby broadcast a report from Bergen-Belsen that day, describing what he had seen in terms that were initially considered too extreme to broadcast. His editors at the BBC asked him to confirm that every word was true before they would transmit it. He confirmed it. The broadcast went out. It remains one of the foundational documents of Holocaust testimony. The liberation of the Western camps by British and American forces in April and May of 1945 proceeded camp by camp, each discovery adding to a body of evidence that the Allied command began systematically documenting from the start. American General Dwight Eisenhower, upon visiting the Ohrdruf subcamp of Buchenwald, one of the first camps encountered by American forces, sent a telegram to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall requesting that members of Congress and journalists be brought to see the evidence in person, specifically because he was concerned that future generations might not believe what had occurred. This is documented history. The Supreme Allied Commander in Europe was already thinking about the credibility of testimony before the war had ended. He required every soldier in the area who was not on the front line to tour the camp. He wanted witnesses. The end of the European War came on the 8th of May, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The specific date matters because it was not the end of death for the survivors. The weeks and months following liberation were, for many, among the most dangerous periods of the entire war. Survivors who had survived the camps died of the sudden reintroduction of food to bodies in advanced states of starvation, a condition now understood as refeeding syndrome, or of the diseases that could not be controlled quickly enough, even with Allied medical personnel deployed. British medical teams at Bergen-Belsen estimated that approximately 13,000 prisoners died after liberation. The survivors who were physically able to travel faced another problem: home for those who attempted to return to Poland, Ukraine, or the Baltic states. They discovered that their homes had been taken, their communities had been destroyed, and in some cases, they were not safe. A pogrom in Kielce, Poland, in July 1946, more than a year after the end of the war, killed approximately 42 Jewish survivors who had returned to their pre-war home. The end of the war was not the end of anti-Semitic violence. The displaced persons problem that confronted the Allied occupation authorities in Germany, Austria, and Italy in the months after liberation was enormous. Approximately 7 million displaced persons were in the Western occupation zones alone, of whom hundreds of thousands were Jewish Holocaust survivors. The United States Army established displaced persons camps, sometimes, in a painful irony, using the same facilities that had been concentration camps, where survivors lived in collective conditions for months and years, while waiting for opportunities to emigrate. President Harry Truman's report on the condition of Jewish displaced persons, compiled by Earl Harrison and submitted in August 1945, found conditions in some displaced persons camps to be unacceptable and contributed to pressure on the British government to allow Jewish immigration to Palestine. The displaced persons crisis, the political dynamics of Palestine, and the aftermath of the Holocaust converged in the years between 1945 and 1948 and contributed directly to the conditions from which the State of Israel was established in May 1948. In the final accounting, 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, approximately two-thirds of the pre-war Jewish population of Europe. The non-Jewish victims of the Nazi camp and killing system included at least 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, more than 3 million non-Jewish Poles, hundreds of thousands of Roma and Sinti, tens of thousands of people with disabilities killed in the T4 program, thousands of gay men, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political prisoners. The total death toll of the Nazi killing system, not counting those killed in combat, numbers in the tens of millions. These numbers require no additional commentary. What they require is the refusal to let them become merely numbers, the ongoing commitment to understand, behind each one, the specificity of a human life that existed before it was taken. Chapter 13. The Nuremberg Trials and the Architecture of Accountability. On the 20th of November 1945, 6 months after the guns fell silent in Europe, a courtroom in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany, the same city where the Nazi racial laws had been proclaimed a decade earlier, was called to order. 24 senior officials of the Nazi state sat in the dock, among them Hermann Göring, once the second most powerful man in the Reich, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, who had signed the pact with the Soviet Union, Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the Army High Command, and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS leader to survive the war and stand trial. Hitler himself, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels had taken their own lives in the final days of the war. Their deaths robbed the courtroom of its most obvious defendants, and that absence shaped everything that followed. Because the trial had to construct accountability through institutional structure, rather than individual charisma. The Nuremberg trials were formally titled the International Military Tribunal. They were convened by the 4 Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, under a charter that established for the first time in international law the categories of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The last of these categories was the most legally novel and the most historically significant. Crimes against humanity encompassed murder, extermination, enslavement, and persecution of civilian populations on political, racial, or religious grounds. Acts that had previously been considered under existing international law, solely within the domestic jurisdiction of individual states. The principle that a government could be held internationally accountable for how it treated its own citizens was not yet established law in 1945. Nuremberg made it law. The legal architecture that emerged from the trial, the Nuremberg Principles, codified by the International Law Commission in 1950, became the foundation for subsequent international humanitarian law, including the Genocide Convention of 1948, and the framework that eventually produced the International Criminal Court. The prosecution's case rested heavily on documentary evidence. The Nazis' own records, produced in extraordinary volume by a state bureaucracy that had documented its own crimes with meticulous thoroughness. This was a feature of the trial that surprised even its architects. Unlike later prosecutions of mass atrocities, where documentary evidence is fragmentary and contested, the Nuremberg prosecutors had access to millions of pages of German government documents captured by Allied forces. Operational reports, administrative memoranda, personnel files, conference minutes. The Wannsee conference minutes were introduced as evidence. The Einsatzgruppen reports, with their precise killing tallies, were introduced. Jürgen Stroop's illustrated report on the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto was introduced. The defendants could not claim the events had not happened, because the events were documented in their own handwriting and in the organizational records of institutions they had led. The defense arguments at Nuremberg followed several predictable lines, all of which have become familiar in subsequent war crimes trials. Most defendants argued that they had followed orders, that they had been part of a system of command authority that removed personal responsibility from individuals executing orders. Some argued that the charges were based on law invented after the fact and applied retroactively. The principle of nullum crimen sine lege, no crime without prior law. Others attempted to distance themselves from the specific crimes charged, arguing that knowledge of the extermination program had been deliberately compartmentalized and that they had not known the full scope of what was being done. The tribunal rejected the superior order's defense explicitly. It ruled that following an unlawful order is not a defense if the individual knew the order was unlawful, and that the extermination of Jews was so clearly unlawful that no rational person could have failed to recognize it. The retroactivity argument was addressed by the observation that the acts prosecuted, murder, enslavement, mass deportation, were recognized as crimes under every legal system in existence, and had not been legal under German law either, notwithstanding the fact that the Nazi state had organized them. Of the 24 defendants indicted at the main Nuremberg trial, 12 were sentenced to death. 7 received prison sentences of varying lengths, 3 were acquitted, and 2 cases were resolved otherwise. Goering was sentenced to death but took cyanide the night before his scheduled execution. The remaining 11 death sentences were carried out by hanging on the 16th of October, 1946. The Nuremberg proceedings continued through a series of subsequent trials. The subsequent Nuremberg trials that addressed specific professional categories: SS doctors, judges who had administered Nazi law, industrialists, military commanders, and the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen trial, which concluded in April 1948, resulted in death sentences for 14 defendants, including Otto Ohlendorf, who had commanded Einsatzgruppe D, and whose unit had killed approximately 90,000 people. Ohlendorf, remarkably, had testified at the main Nuremberg trial with considerable candor about the scale of his unit's killings. He was hanged in June 1951. The Nuremberg trials were not universally admired at the time, even among people who supported their general purpose. The Soviet Union's participation was complicated by the fact that Soviet forces had committed documented war crimes of their own during the conflict, including the Katyn massacre of Polish officers. The Soviet delegation's attempt to introduce Katyn as a German war crime was quietly dropped after German defense lawyers began to produce evidence pointing to Soviet responsibility. The American and British governments had their own discomfort with the retroactivity issue. The acquittals of Franz von Papen, Hjalmar Schacht, and Hans Fritzsche were genuinely controversial, with Soviet judges issuing dissents, arguing for conviction in all three cases. These tensions and imperfections do not invalidate the trials or their historical importance. They are simply evidence that the trials were a real legal proceeding rather than a theatrical performance, that they involved genuine argument, genuine evidence assessment, and outcomes that were not entirely predetermined. The legacy of Nuremberg in subsequent international law is simultaneously clear and incomplete. The Genocide Convention, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 9th of December 1948, one day before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was the direct institutional response to the Holocaust, defining genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, and obligating signatory states to prevent and punish it. The convention has been in force since 1951 and has been cited in prosecutions before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the International Criminal Court. Its record in actually preventing genocide, however, is decidedly mixed. The Cambodian genocide of the 1970s, the Rwandan genocide of 1994, the Srebrenica massacre of 1995, and the more recent documented atrocities against the Yazidi population of Iraq all occurred after the Genocide Convention was legally operative. The gap between the existence of a legal standard and the political will to enforce it remains one of the central unresolved problems in international order. The West German government, established in 1949 from the three Western occupation zones, took a distinctive approach to the question of accountability that differs substantially from the policies of East Germany. The Federal Republic conducted its own prosecutions through German courts, most notably the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, which tried 22 former Auschwitz SS personnel and produced extensive testimonial and documentary evidence about the camp's operation that entered the German public record. The East German government, by contrast, claimed that it represented an entirely new state with no institutional continuity to the Nazi regime, a position that allowed it to avoid systematic denazification of its institutions, while simultaneously claiming moral authority over the question of Nazi crimes. The reparations agreement signed between West Germany and Israel in 1952, negotiated despite enormous controversy within Israel, where many survivors found any transaction with Germany morally intolerable, provided 3 billion Deutsche Marks to Israel over 12 years, and established individual compensation claims for survivors. The agreement was bitterly debated in the Israeli Knesset, where some members opposed it on the grounds that accepting German money constituted an implicit forgiveness of crimes that were not forgivable. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 brought the question of Holocaust accountability to a new generation of global attention. Eichmann had escaped to Argentina after the war under a false identity and had been located by Israeli intelligence. The Mossad abducted him from Buenos Aires in May 1960 and brought him to Israel, where he was tried under an Israeli law specifically enacted for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. The trial was televised, the first major trial to be broadcast, and introduced the testimony of dozens of Holocaust survivors to a world audience, many of whom were hearing these accounts in direct, personal form for the first time. Eichmann was convicted and hanged in May 1962, the only execution ever carried out by the State of Israel. The philosopher Hannah Arendt covered the trial for The New Yorker and later published her account as Eichmann in Jerusalem, in which she coined the phrase, the banality of evil, to describe Eichmann's apparent lack of demonic motivation. His presentation as a bureaucratic functionary focused on the efficient performance of his administrative role. The phrase and the concept have been debated ever since. Some historians argue it understates Eichmann's actual ideological commitment. Others argue it captures something essential about the way bureaucratic structures distribute and dilute moral responsibility for collective crimes. The Nuremberg framework established a principle that has not fully been honored and has not fully been abandoned, that there is a category of human behavior so fundamentally hostile to the basic conditions of human existence that it cannot be treated as merely the internal affair of the state that organizes it. This principle is fragile. It is contested constantly by governments, including powerful ones, who resist any external constraint on how they treat people within their borders. It survives because people, lawyers, judges, activists, historians, and ordinary citizens in many countries have continued to argue for it, case by case, decade by decade, in the face of political resistance. The trials at Nuremberg did not end impunity, but they introduced the idea that impunity was not inevitable. That is not a small thing. Chapter 14, Memory, Denial, and the Long Aftermath Memory is not a passive process. It is not the automatic registration of events onto a permanent tape that can be played back with consistent accuracy across time. Memory is active, selective, contested, and shaped by the needs of the present as much as by the facts of the past. The memory of the Holocaust. How it has been remembered, misremembered, suppressed, instrumentalized, and debated across the 8 decades since liberation is itself a significant historical subject, one that tells us a great deal not only about the event itself, but about how societies process catastrophic guilt, inherited trauma, and the political uses of historical consciousness. In the immediate post-war years, the dominant mode in Western Europe was something closer to silence than to active remembrance. West Germany was in the process of rebuilding its economy and its international legitimacy under Konrad Adenauer, and while the Nuremberg prosecutions and the reparations agreement represented institutional engagement with the past, the broader West German society engaged in what historians have called a period of collective avoidance. Many perpetrators and participants in the Nazi system were reintegrated into post-war West German institutions. The judiciary, the civil service, the diplomatic corps, academia, without formal vetting processes that were applied rigorously. The first federal chancellor's own chief of staff, Hans Globke, had written official legal commentaries on the Nuremberg race laws during the Nazi period. He served Adenauer until 1963. This is not an exceptional case. It is representative of a broader pattern, whose extent German historians began documenting systematically only in the 1980s and 1990s. In the United States, the Holocaust occupied a relatively modest position in American public consciousness through the 1950s and much of the 1960s. The Second World War was memorialized primarily as a story of American military heroism and democratic victory over fascism, with the specific fate of European Jews as a secondary element. The Ken Burns documentary series, The War, released in 2007, was criticized by some scholars for initially devoting relatively little attention to the Holocaust in its account of the American war experience. The NBC television series Holocaust, broadcast in 1978 and watched by approximately 120 million Americans, is widely credited with bringing Holocaust consciousness to mainstream American culture in a way that academic scholarship had not. That a fictional drama accomplished what decades of testimony and scholarship had not, in terms of mass cultural penetration, is itself a revealing data point about how collective memory is actually formed, through narrative and identification as much as through information. The American scholar Peter Novick's 1999 book, The Holocaust in American Life, raised uncomfortable questions about the political uses of Holocaust memory in American Jewish communal life and American political culture more broadly. Novick argued that Holocaust memory had become a central pillar of American Jewish identity at precisely the historical moment when other grounds of Jewish communal cohesion, religious observance, immigrant generation solidarity, shared experience of discrimination were weakening, and that this centrality of Holocaust memory served communal purposes that were not always identical with historical accuracy or moral clarity. His book was controversial and generated a substantial scholarly response. It exemplifies what genuine historical engagement looks like, not the reverent treatment of a sacred subject, but the careful, sometimes uncomfortable scrutiny of how history is used. Holocaust denial. The claim that the Holocaust did not occur or was substantially fabricated emerged in organized form almost immediately after the war and has persisted as a current in far-right political and pseudo-historical culture to the present day. Its leading figures, Paul Rassinier in France, Arthur Butz in the United States, Ernst Zundel in Canada, David Irving in Britain, have argued variously that the gas chambers were post-war inventions, that the 6 million figure was wildly exaggerated, or that Hitler did not order or know about the systematic killing of Jews. These claims have been comprehensively refuted by the historical record and in notable cases by legal proceedings. David Irving's libel suit against historian Deborah Lipstadt, decided by the English High Court in April 2000, resulted in a comprehensive judicial finding that Irving was a deliberate distorter of history who had falsified evidence to support his denial of the Holocaust. The judgment was not merely a legal ruling, it was a detailed historiographical assessment, conducted under the conditions of a legal proceeding with full access to evidence and argument on both sides, that established the evidentiary basis for the Holocaust's history as a matter of judicial record. The ongoing discovery and prosecution of Nazi war criminals in the decades after the war has created a complex and sometimes troubling record. The Nazi hunting work of Simon Wiesenthal and, more institutionally, of the Israeli police unit Eichmann was expanded into the Office of Special Investigations in the American Department of Justice, established in 1979 specifically to investigate and denaturalize former Nazis who had entered the United States under fraudulent pretenses. The OSI eventually identified and successfully prosecuted or deported dozens of individuals, including some who had lived as apparently unremarkable American citizens for decades. The last conviction under the OSI's mandate came in 2012, when Jacques Palich, a former guard at the Trauniki labor camp in Poland, was deported from the United States to Germany, where he died in 2019 at the age of 95, without having stood trial. He had lived in Queens, New York, for more than 60 years. His neighbors reportedly had no knowledge of his wartime history until the denaturalization proceedings became public. The memorialization of the Holocaust has taken many physical and institutional forms across the world. Yad Vashem, established in Jerusalem in 1953, is the world's primary Holocaust memorial and research institution, maintaining the most comprehensive documentary database of Holocaust victims and perpetrators in existence, and housing a museum that has been expanded and redesigned multiple times, most recently in a facility designed by Moshe Safdie that opened in 2005. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., opened in 1993 on the National Mall. The symbolic center of American civic life receives more than 1 million visitors annually and has conducted major documentary and educational programs that have extended Holocaust awareness in the United States, particularly among school-age populations. Memorials have been built across Europe. The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in central Berlin, designed by architect Peter Eisenman and opened in 2005, consists of 2,711 concrete slabs of varying heights on a sloping field, creating a disorienting landscape that resists any single interpretive frame. The relationship between Holocaust memory and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is among the most politically charged and historiographically complex areas in contemporary engagement with this history. The Holocaust's direct relationship to the founding of the State of Israel, through the displacement of Holocaust survivors who sought refuge from a Europe that had tried to murder them, through the political acceleration of Zionism, through the international sympathy generated by the exposure of the camps, is documented history. The use of Holocaust memory in contemporary Israeli political discourse, and the countercharge that invoking it serves to insulate Israeli policy from criticism, are political arguments that take place in a space far removed from historical analysis. This documentary's purpose is not to adjudicate those arguments. It is to establish the historical foundation from which serious engagement with them requires proceeding, which means starting from the documented reality of what happened and refusing both the instrumentalization of genocide for contemporary political purposes and the use of political grievance as grounds for questioning the historical record. The question of generational transmission, how Holocaust memory is passed to generations that have no personal connection to it, has become increasingly urgent as the survivor generation ages and diminishes. By the mid-2020s, the number of living Holocaust survivors has declined to a small fraction of what it was at liberation. The voices that will eventually no longer be available are irreplaceable, not the general shape of the history, which is extensively documented in testimony, film, and scholarship, but the specific texture of individual experience, the weight of a particular memory in a particular person's body, the way a survivor pauses when asked a specific question, the thing that remains unspeakable even after decades of testimony. The USC Shoah Foundation, established by Steven Spielberg following the production of Schindler's List, has recorded testimonies from more than 55,000 survivors and witnesses in 65 countries. That archive is one of the largest oral history collections in existence. When the last survivor dies, it will be what remains. Memory is a form of witness. Witness is a form of resistance. The act of remembering what was done, specifically, accurately, without comfort, without the softening of euphemism, is the minimum that the dead can ask of the living. This chapter cannot be closed because the act it describes is ongoing. Every student who learns this history for the first time is adding their attention to a chain of witness that began when the first survivor spoke. Every documentary that gets this history right, that names names, that keeps numbers as people rather than statistics, that refuses to look away from the bureaucratic mechanism of mass murder, is a continuation of that witness. And every act of remembrance is, in its small way, a refusal of the logic that made the killing possible, the logic that some human beings are less than human. Chapter 15. What remains? Lessons, legacies, and the unfinished reckoning. Let me end where we must end, not with resolution, because there is none but with reckoning. The word itself is worth pausing on. Reckoning comes from an Old English root meaning to count, to account for, to determine the position of a vessel at sea by calculating from known reference points where you are and where you are headed. That is precisely what this final chapter attempts. Not to draw a tidy moral, not to extract a redemptive conclusion from unredeemable events, but to stand at the known reference point of documented history and determine, as honestly as possible, where we are and what that history requires of us. The first thing the history of the Holocaust requires is accuracy. The systematic assault on historical fact that Holocaust denial represents, and the more insidious, quieter assault of misremembering, oversimplification, and the reduction of complex history to cartoon images of monstrous villains and passive victims, does not merely distort the past. It actively undermines our capacity to recognize analogous dynamics in the present. If the Holocaust is understood as the product of an aberrant individual's psychology, then its lesson is simply, watch out for Hitler types. If it is understood as the product of a specific national character or a unique historical pathology confined to one time and place, then its lesson is, that can't happen here. Both understandings are historically wrong. Both are, in their wrongness, dangerous. The actual history, the documented, argued, peer-reviewed, archivally grounded history, tells us that the Holocaust was produced by ordinary political processes, operating under ordinary human pressures. The pressure of economic crisis, the pressure of national humiliation, the pressure of ideological radicalization, enabled by the systematic degradation of democratic institutions, and the pressure of social conformity that led millions of ordinary people to participate in, facilitate, or silently acquiesce to a program of mass murder that they had sufficient information to understand. None of these pressures are unique to Germany in the 1930s. None of them are historical curiosities that belong to a safely enclosed past. That is the most important sentence in this entire documentary, and it deserves to be said plainly, rather than dressed up in the language of historical distance. The second thing this history requires is specificity. There is a tendency, when confronted with numbers as large as 6 million, to retreat into abstraction, to speak of the Holocaust as a totality, as an event, as a historical phenomenon. This retreat is understandable. The mind cannot hold 6 million individual losses simultaneously, but the abstraction, if left uncorrected, becomes a kind of forgetting. The historian Yad Vashem's Hall of Names contains approximately 4.8 million pages of testimony, forms submitted by survivors, relatives, and researchers documenting the names, birth dates, places of origin, and circumstances of death of individual victims. The project of recovering the names of all 6 million is not complete and may never be complete. But every name recovered is a specific refusal of the anonymity that the killing program imposed. Every name recovered is a restoration of personhood to someone whose personhood the Nazi state tried to permanently erase. The historiography of the Holocaust has changed significantly over the 8 decades since liberation, and those changes are themselves instructive about how historical knowledge develops. The earliest scholarship, produced in the immediate post-war years, largely by survivors and by organizations with direct connections to the survivor community, focused primarily on documenting what had happened, assembling the evidentiary record. Raoul Hilberg's monumental study, The Destruction of the European Jews, first published in 1961, shifted the analytical frame toward the administrative and bureaucratic mechanisms of the killing process, focusing on the perpetrating institutions rather than the victims. This was controversial at the time, particularly in Israel, where the emphasis on the administrative machinery was perceived as insufficiently attentive to Jewish resistance and agency. The scholarly debates of the 1980s and 1990s broadened the lens further. Christopher Browning's work on the order police examined perpetrators at the lowest institutional levels. Jan Gross's 2001 study Neighbors documented the Jedwabne massacre, in which Polish Catholic neighbors killed their Jewish neighbors in a pogrom in July 1941. reopening the deeply uncomfortable question of Polish participation in the Holocaust in ways that generated enormous controversy in Poland. The scholarly expansion continues. Recent work has increasingly focused on the Holocaust in countries beyond the core German-Polish axis, on the experience of specific demographic groups within the broader victim population, and on the recovery of perpetrator documentation from archives in the former Soviet Union that only became accessible after 1991. Germany's relationship with its own Nazi past has been described by scholars as a model of national historical reckoning, and it is, by comparative standards, genuinely remarkable. The concept of Erinnerungskultur, memory culture, has been central to German public and educational life for decades. The Holocaust is taught in German schools with sustained attention. Holocaust denial is a criminal offense in Germany, under Section 130 of the Criminal Code. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe occupies a prominent site in the center of Berlin, within sight of the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate. German political leaders have repeatedly and publicly acknowledged German responsibility for the Holocaust, in terms that have no equivalent in the political discourse of most other perpetrating or collaborating nations. At the same time, historians including Saul Friedlander and Michael Rothberg have noted that even the most developed national memory cultures have blind spots and limitations, that Germany's reckoning, substantial as it is, has at certain moments served to establish Germany as the singular site of perpetration in ways that have allowed collaborating nations to avoid equivalent reckoning with their own histories. The question of reparations, financial compensation and restitution to Holocaust victims and their heirs, remains an active and unresolved area of legal and political engagement more than 8 decades after the war. Switzerland, under sustained international pressure in the 1990s, opened its wartime bank records and established funds to compensate the heirs of victims whose assets had been deposited in Swiss banks and never returned after the war. European insurance companies, including several major institutions, paid into compensation funds in the late 1990s after documentation emerged, showing that policies purchased by Jewish clients before the war had been voided or simply not paid out after the war. The restitution of looted art remains an ongoing process. The Washington Principles on Nazi Confiscated Art, agreed in 1998 by 44 nations, established guidelines for the identification and restitution of cultural property looted by the Nazis, but implementation has been uneven and subject to legal, archival, and political obstacles in many countries. As of the mid-2020s, thousands of artworks that passed through the wartime looting chain remain in institutional or private collections, their ownership histories documented, but the restitution process incomplete. The rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and globally since approximately 2015, documented in annual surveys by organizations including the Anti-Defamation League and the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, has reintroduced a sense of urgency to Holocaust education that had, in some quarters, been treated as an established institutional routine rather than an active necessity. The Pittsburgh synagogue shooting of October 2018, in which 11 Jewish worshippers were killed during a Shabbat morning service, the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history, was carried out by a perpetrator whose expressed ideology drew directly on anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish-led immigration. The Halle synagogue attack in Germany in October 2019 targeted a synagogue on Yom Kippur. The Jersey City attack in December 2019. These are not medieval events. They are recent. They happen in countries with fully developed Holocaust memorial infrastructures, Holocaust education requirements in schools, and public commitments to never again. The phrase never again, coined in the wake of the Holocaust, has been repeated so often across so many contexts that it has in some usages become a slogan detached from the specific historical and institutional analysis required to give it practical content. The question of what never again actually requires, in concrete institutional, political, and social terms, is the most serious question that Holocaust history poses to the present. It requires, at minimum, the maintenance of democratic institutions and the resistance of their erosion, because the Holocaust did not occur in a functioning democracy. It requires the rejection of political movements that build their appeal on the identification and persecution of defined groups as the source of national problems, because this is the identifiable political dynamic from which genocide emerges. It requires the protection of minority rights, not merely when it is politically costless, but especially when it is politically costly, because the moments when minority protection most requires active defense are precisely the moments when the political incentives run in the opposite direction. It requires honest journalism, independent courts, and educational institutions that teach history without the softening of national vanity. None of these requirements are technically complicated. All of them are politically difficult. The Holocaust demonstrates what happens over years, step by step, through a long sequence of ordinary decisions by ordinary people, when they are progressively abandoned. The survivors who have spoken and written and testified across 8 decades have collectively made one request that has been consistent across all the variation of their individual experiences and perspectives. They have asked to be believed. They have asked that what they endured be accepted as real, not metaphorically real, not hyperbolically real, but factually, documentably, specifically real. They have asked that their families, the grandmothers and uncles and siblings and childhood friends whose names they still carry, be acknowledged as having existed, as having mattered, as having been human beings, whose deaths were losses rather than statistics. That request is not a large one in the abstract. It requires only attention and honesty. But attention and honesty are, as it turns out, not the easiest things for human beings and human societies to sustain. Elie Wiesel, in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in December 1986, said, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." He said this not as a purely personal moral statement, but as a conclusion drawn from the most specific and documented experience of what silence produces. He had watched what the silence of governments and neighbors and institutions produced in his own lifetime, in his own community, in his own family. His mother and younger sister were killed at Auschwitz-Birkenau on the night of their arrival. His father died in Buchenwald in January 1945, weeks before liberation. He spoke from evidence that no one asked him to acquire. This documentary ends not with a summary. The history we have traced across 15 chapters does not compress into a summary without losing the specificity that is its most important quality, but with an acknowledgement of obligation. We owe the dead accuracy. We owe them the refusal of comforting myths about their passivity, or their agency, or their fate. We owe them the acknowledgement that what happened to them was done by human beings who were, before they became perpetrators, ordinary, which means it was done by the kind of people who exist in every era and every society, including this one. We owe the survivors the dignity of believing them. We owe subsequent generations the education that makes believing them not merely an emotional act, but an informed one. And we owe ourselves, collectively, as participants in the political and social structures that either protect or fail to protect human dignity, the honest reckoning with what this history demonstrates, about what those structures require to function justly. The Holocaust is not history in the sense of something finished and resolved. It is history in the sense that matters most. A documented record of what human beings are capable of, offered to every generation that comes after as both warning and test. You have reached the end of this documentary. If you have watched this far, you have spent several hours with one of the most difficult and most important chapters in the entire record of human experience. Share this documentary with someone who hasn't seen it. Recommend it to a teacher, a student, a parent, a friend who thinks this history doesn't concern them. Subscribe so that when new long-form historical documentaries of this kind are produced on this channel, you are the first to know. Leave a comment, not about what you felt, though that matters, but about what you learned that you didn't know before. That is the most useful comment you can leave. History requires readers. It requires people who take it seriously enough to pass it on. That is the only way never again becomes something more than a phrase.